In this video, I will teach you everything there is to know about knights, and after watching this video, you will be better than 95% of chess players at using the knight, and you will even be able to execute three-dimensional forks. So, in this video, I will first focus on knights in the opening and the middle game. We're also going to be looking at knight attacks, knight tactics, and then at the end, we are going to look at knight endgames. In general, in the opening, the thing you want to do is to fight for these 4 squares as much as possible. And that means putting pawns in those squares and also attacking those with your bishops and your knights. And that is why most of the time you will see that the knights in the opening will move to f3 and c3. And the reason why we do this is of course because we want to have influence. Our kingside knight is going to influence the dark squares and the queenside knight is going to influence the light squares. Because of course a knight always attacks the different color from the square that it is currently on. So that's why those 2 squares are very popular for knights. But something very important to keep in mind is that especially for your queenside knight, most of the time it is beneficial to push this pawn first and then place the knight behind it. Because that way you actually have double pressure here on this d5 square, once with your pawn and once with your knight. If you imagine this pawn still being here on c2, we would actually be blocking our own pawn with the knight and it would be hard to add the extra attacker to the d5 square. Of course, you can play this. There are openings like the Jobava London that actually do play this, but in general, this is a good rule to keep in mind. You can think the same thing for the king side. It might be better to play f4 first and then your knight to f3. But the problem with moving the f-pawn, of course, is always there are opportunities that you will get a check by the enemy queen. So in general, I don't recommend that specific variation, but there are again openings like the Stonewall system where you can play this. One thing that many players also don't know is that knights can sometimes be useful on the first or on the second rank if they need to do some defensive role. For example, here you can see black is basically threatening to checkmate us here on h2. But since we have this knight on f1, it's actually protecting us from the checkmate. And this can be better than having the knight on f3 in some cases. Because the knight on f3, of course, would also protect this, but it can always be attacked, for example, by the pawn push or maybe by the bishop. And then if we lose our knight, suddenly we will get checkmated. So especially this f1 square is a common square where you can place a knight. You can do that by moving your kingside knight 3 times, or of course, your queenside knight can get there even quicker because it only needs 2 moves to get there from the queenside. So those are some general things to keep in mind. The knights also often support a central push. So for example, here we can push the pawn to e4 and this is backed up by the knight. If this is taken, now we can move forward and we can move our knight up the board. And usually, the further your knight moves on the board, the more powerful it will become. And a knight on the 4th rank is already stronger than one on the 3rd rank. I will talk more about that in the middle game section. Here you can also see we are attacking the bishop, so the bishop has to move. Maybe we can also play g3, which helps to stop this. And you will also notice that in some lines, you will create this g2 square, and that is sometimes where a knight can be useful on g2 as well, especially if you need to defend, because then you have some extra defensive power here on the f4 and the h4 square. One more thing I want to talk about knights in the opening is, of course, you can also put your knights on the 2nd rank like this, both your kingside and your queenside knight. Sometimes this is done if you want to help support the center, but this is a bit more passive, of course, because you can see this knight also has some attacking potential. If you put them here, it's purely defensive. But sometimes it can even be useful to put a knight on the rim. Usually they always say a knight on the rim is dim, you shouldn't do this, but there are some cases where this can be useful, especially with your queenside knight. Because this queenside knight, if you move it to the rim, then you will have access to this c5 square and even this b4 square. And from there, again, the knight can influence a lot of crucial squares in our enemy camp. And we also have a knight on the 4th rank, because 1, 2, 3, 4, if we start counting from our side, this is of course the 4th rank for us. There are things you need to know about this. For example, imagine this pawn being all the way back here. You wouldn't want to play your knight here and just get captured by the bishop and end up with doubled pawns. That's not such a good thing. But sometimes it's smart to actually play a5 first and then on the next move play your knight to a6. So just imagine if this bishop was able to capture the knight, at least we would be able to capture back with the bishop. or with the bishop, with the rook, of course, I mean. But I was already thinking about the next thing, and that was that I wanted to say that sometimes this can also help, playing b6 first, and then later on developing your knight to a6. And if it were to be captured, of course right now it can't be captured, but if it were to be captured, you would be able to recapture with your bishop and also get an active bishop. So that is how sometimes it can be useful to activate your knight on the rim. Next, we have to talk about this thing that I already mentioned, how a knight will increase in power as it moves up the board. And that makes a lot of sense, of course, because we have already been talking about these first and second rank knights, which are purely defensive most of the time. Third rank knights usually end up there because of the opening, and then they are mainly used for influencing the central squares. But the knight on the fourth rank is already more active and is stronger than a knight on the third rank, because we can see that we are also currently controlling some squares and the enemy camp as well, and we could even use the knight to launch an attack here on the king side or the queen side. So this already looks quite promising. You could already imagine some variation where we can suddenly launch an attack here, maybe in some line, not here of course, because we would just be losing the knight, but in some line you can imagine we would be activating this, maybe go for some sacrifice. Or you could also just keep the knight here and have a lot of influence over these squares as well, and that makes it harder for black to develop their pieces. If we move our knight one more square, and now we have a position with a knight on the 5th rank, this knight is even more excellent. And the knight on the 5th rank is usually better than a bishop, because, well, the knight influences squares up to the 7th rank. And that means we really have a lot of attacking power, especially here. You can see all these arrows pointing towards the enemy king as well. We do have some attacking opportunities here as well. What this knight is currently using is also known as an outpost square. And that is a square where the knight is supported by a pawn, and also our knight cannot be attacked by any other pawns. And that's especially powerful because if you just imagine this pawn being here, if they can push it and attack our knight, well, we don't really have such a strong square, because we would just be forced to move our knight again. So if you ever see something like this happening, where a square suddenly opens up for your knight in the enemy camp and you already have a pawn supporting it, no other pawns can attack it, it is very useful if you can place your knight there. The best possible knight is probably this one. That is a knight on the 6th rank, which is also known as a octopus. And the reason this knight is known as an octopus is of course because a knight will always attack 8 different squares, and all of the squares the knight is attacking here are very useful. First of all, we are attacking some central squares and also so many squares into the enemy camp. So this is the best knight you could potentially get. And again here, we are on a very crucial square on an open file, double protected by the pawns. No pawns can attack us, and this bishop can't trade for the knight either. So very strong. This knight is actually so strong that sometimes it's worth sacrificing a rook for the knight just to stop it. And this position that wouldn't help, but sometimes you can sack the rook and then get a knight and a pawn in exchange, and then it can be worth it. Pushing your knight even further up the board to the 7th or 8th rank is not useful, because you are going to get diminishing returns. That just means it's less useful to do this. Sometimes there are some tricks where you need a knight here to deliver a checkmate, but in general you want to stop at the 6th rank, and if you can get your knight there, it is actually equally strong to a rook. Well, now here we have a position where we don't have an active knight yet, but we do have some potential outposts. So the question is, how are we going to get there? Well, if I look at this, the first things that I'm thinking about is these squares. This square is also useful. If I look at the queen side, maybe a square like this or this could also be useful. But then you have to start eliminating. This is on the edge of the board, so not that active. Here we would be traded by the bishop or maybe kicked away by the pawn. So we don't want that either. Those two squares here, the dark squares, we have the problem that the knight would be able to take us. So we actually don't want that as well. And that way we can determine that this is a really good light square here on e4 for the knight. And if you figure something like that out and you realize there's a good square for your knight, it's always worth moving your knight to place it there. Here we can do that in 2 moves, but even if you would have to play 3 or 4 moves, it can really be beneficial to do this, because you are basically activating a more passive piece. Knight on the 2nd rank, not so good, and we are going to upgrade it and make it a knight on the 4th rank, which is most of the time equally strong to a bishop or even a little bit stronger. So And this position, since we have a pretty close center, this is going to be an incredible knight, and the best thing black can do is actually exchange their bishop for the knight. And you might think, well, what's the purpose of doing this if in the end we are going to get an exchange anyways? But the thing that we then have to calculate is this exchange beneficial for us or not? And here I think it's a beneficial exchange because first of all, this pawn can help us start an attack on the enemy king because it's some extra support, and also this open file, even though black can use the file first, well, there's actually not much for black to do here, and then we can start this attack and we have some support. So sometimes you will put your knight on a very good square, you will know that it will be captured, but it's fine because even if it's captured, you will create some other benefits in your position. One very important thing a knight can also do is serve as a crucial defender, and this is usually when you use the knight as a blockader. So this means we are going to blockade an enemy pawn, we are going to prevent the pawn from pushing forward. So here we have a position in which we have a knight and two bishops against a knight and two bishops. We have the open file with the queen, so that's already saying something that black has a little bit better position here. Also, we have a little bit more space on the queen side, our pawns are a bit more advanced. But we do have the problem that this knight is not very active, and currently white is challenging to just exchange this knight, and maybe in some line they might also start pushing this pawn. So one very strong thing you can do with a knight is you can put it in front of an enemy pawn if this is an isolated pawn. So meaning there are no pawns in these files here next to the enemy pawn. So the pawn is all isolated, it can't be defended, but also that means there are no pawns that can attack your knight. So if you place a knight here, you can prevent the pawn from pushing, so you can blockade it. But the reason a knight is especially strong is whenever you use a piece to blockade, let's imagine this is a rook for example, we're also losing some of our mobility because we can't access those squares because they are behind the pawn. Same with the queen. Sometimes with a bishop it can also be useful, but then we would be looking at these bricks of pawns that we can't really do anything. But with the knight we are both blockading the pawn and also we still have influence over squares in the enemy camp. Our knight actually doesn't care that this pawn is standing here because it doesn't limit the mobility at all. And that is why the knight can be a crucial defender, and here especially instead of going for this exchange, which wouldn't be so great because we are actually helping white, the best thing would be to just put the knight in the center. Here we have one more case of using the knight as a blockader that is a little bit more advanced. But if we look at this position, we can see that there is actually a hole here in our position. We have a problem. It would have been better for us if we still had a pawn here, and this pawn would be protecting those two pawns, but we don't have one. And that means that basically white has a passed pawn that they can start pushing as well, or they can also use this to try to take away some squares in our camp. So what do we want to do? We would like to place a knight here because, well, the knight would be stopping the pawn from pushing, and also, of course, we can influence these two squares as well. So here we would be playing a move like knight to c4, let's say they play b3, and then we can play knight to d6. And then here we are blockading the pawn. We also have some influence still over other squares, so if I just play a couple of moves in the future, we might even though this knight is actually a defender, we might even use it to support a pawn push, maybe to support opening up some lines here on the queen side. So that is an especially useful way you can use a knight as a defender. Now we are going to take a look at a bunch of attacking patterns and tactics. First, I'm going to cover some tactics, and then we will also take a look at a bunch of checkmates you can do with a knight. The most basic tactic that you can execute with a knight, of course, is the fork. Fork just meaning you are attacking two pieces at the same time, especially if the enemy king is one of them. That is extremely useful. Here we even have the triple fork because we are attacking both the rook, the king, and the queen. That's what I wanted to say. And I have a good question here as well. You might be thinking, well, why don't we just take the queen for free anyways? Because this is a free queen. But the problem would be that white can give us this check. Let's say we try to defend with the knight, and yeah, the material is actually in white's benefit here. So that is why we need to go for this fork. The enemy king is going to move. But this shows an incredibly important thing about forks as well, because again, taking this queen actually wouldn't be so great, because the rook can take here, and again, this position is better for white. So the thing we want to do is we want to both fork, but then we want to do another fork here on g3. So this is our second fork, 2 forks in a row, and then we can capture this queen. So those are patterns you have to try and see that if you can do a fork, instead of just thinking very limited to the fact that, okay, I will do a fork and I will capture material, you have to think, can I do a fork and then maybe do a second fork as a follow-up as well, as we can in this position. Here again, it is white to move, and this is a bit more of a complicated fork, but I hope you can try to solve this. For all of these tactics, of course, if you want, you can always pause the video and see if you can find them. So it's white to move, and immediately we are going to win material here and 2 moves basically. So we don't have any immediate fork. We don't have anything. And if you think about taking this knight, that's actually not so good, because most of the time you're just going to get an endgame. The pawn structure is a bit better for white, but this is probably going to be a draw. So the good thing that the right thing that we can do here is to play queen to a3. That's a check. Of course, black doesn't want to block with a rook. That would be pretty devastating. They have to move a king, and now you can already see, if you see the 2 pieces lined up like this, you can already imagine your knight going there. So we can play knight e7 check, and of course the rook can take us, but then we have a winning position. So even things like this, realizing that we don't have a fork immediately, but imagining the fact that if we could move the king somehow, we might be able to do a fork. And now this is the last one. This is a bit more advanced. Another variation in which we are going to do a fork. So this is a pretty dynamic position. Black is attacking our bishop. We are potentially going to take here with the pawn, the knight, or the rook. We have a lot of possibilities. So the question is, are we going to defend this? Maybe we are going to take this knight. It's a pretty messy position. But a really nice trick we can play here is take this with the knight. And this is the best move out of all options. And the thing is, we realize that again, you can see the pieces lined up like this. That means there isn't actually a potential forking square here on e7. So we're not going to care about the fact that we can take this or this or this. Nothing matters. All we are going to do, of course, is we are going to take this. And if they capture us, we are going to do a check. And this is again one of those special checks that I mentioned, because this is a fork, but at the same time our queen is under attack. But we have the benefit that it's not just a regular fork. We can do a double fork again. We can take this, that's a check, and then we can move the queen. Here we have an example of a discovered attack. So what we are going to do here is we will play our knight to f6, because we want to force the enemy king onto the diagonal of our queen. And that is a very important theme as well. Giving a check with the knight, taking away those 2 squares, putting it on the same diagonal as the queen, or sometimes even a bishop. And then if we move the knight, this is a check. Something has to happen, and here we can of course take the queen. We have some more examples of this as well. For example, here you can see white is already setting up a checkmating attack, and sometimes your knight doesn't have to be the most amazing piece that is capturing all of the enemies, but sometimes you can also just use your knight for some nasty discovery. For example, here we're just going to move the knight and threaten a basic checkmate, but at the same time our rook is opened up. So that's a very common theme as well. If you have a piece and it's limited by the knight, don't worry, in the future you might be able to move your knight and then open up a discovery. So black actually has to choose to stop the checkmate here, or of course they can also give away the queen, but probably they're going to choose to stop the checkmate, and then we can win this queen. This is an incredibly beautiful one as well. So if you want, I would definitely recommend to try and solve this puzzle. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing puzzle. I'm going to show you the solution here because it's a good pattern to recognize as well. And that's my main goal, is to make you recognize all of these patterns so you remember them for your own games. Here we can give a check with the rook, only with this rook. That's the only variation that's going to win material. First of all, this is a checkmate. If they go to f1, it's a checkmate. Checkmate in 2. Check with the rook and just checkmate. And this is a basic rook checkmate, but the rook is of course defended by the knight. The thing I wanted to show was if the king goes here, there's an incredibly beautiful line. We play this, knight check, and also a fork. We are giving away a rook, but this is one of those next level forks I have been talking about, where we give a check, we do a fork, we move our knight, and this time it's not a second fork, but here we have a check with the rook, and then we can just take this rook as well. And then this is just a winning endgame position. One more here, and this is also a common pattern. We are going to use the knight and team up with our queen. We are going to play our queen here to a4. That's a check. Not much black can do. b5, of course, would be pretty terrible. c6 seems like the best move. It's blocking the check. And also, yeah, basically stopping us from capturing the pawn, but we can actually still capture the pawn here. We can sacrifice our knight, and if they take this, we can take, and this is going to be a checkmate, of course. Rook to d1, and the only thing black can do is watch how we checkmate them. So really, knight and queen, I think knight and queen is an incredibly strong combo. Whenever you want to set up an attack, if you can activate knight and queen together, you can do a lot of things because the knight can reach the squares that the queen can't reach. The queen can go diagonally up and down the board, but it can't reach those nasty knight squares. But if you team it up with a knight, you will be able to reach any square that you want. Now we're going to take a look at the double check as well. So the double check is like a discovered attack, but we are going to give literally a double check 2 times at the same time. So here we can move the knight. That's a discovered attack, of course, because we are moving, and at the same time we have an attack on this queen, but the queen is protected, so we're not going to do anything about that. But we can move this pawn, and this is one of those double checks. And whenever you have a double check, your opponent's options are very limited. Basically, the only thing they can do is move the king. And yeah, usually they don't have that many squares. This is, of course, a checkmate, queen and knight combo. This is also a checkmate. This is a pawn and queen combo. If they can't take this knight because the knight is protected by the bishop. And if they take this pawn, that's also a checkmate here. Queen to g5 checkmate. So if you are looking for these discovered attacks, sometimes you will also be able to do a discovered check. And this is our final double check, where we are going to use the knight again, and this is a pretty good example as well, because you can see the queen line up with the enemy king, and we can give check with this knight. So moves like this are incredibly powerful, because they can't block. They can't block this check because they would still be in check by the knight. They have to move the king, and then we just have a simple, again, knight and queen working together. The king has to go somewhere, and then we have a checkmate. Now we're going to take a look at a bunch of checkmating patterns with the knight. These are especially important because when you are attacking, of course, the end goal of your attack is usually to do a checkmate or to threaten a checkmate and make sure that the only way they can prevent it is by giving away material. The most famous checkmate for the knight is, of course, the smothered checkmate, which is usually done with a knight in combination with a queen. So as I said, especially powerful combo, those two together. And here we can do that by playing knight to f7. And first of all, if the rook takes, this is just a pretty basic checkmate with a queen, just a back rank mate basically. So that means the king has to go, and now you can immediately see this pattern that we have been studying already. We can move the knight. This is a discovered check, a double check. The king has to go to the corner, and now this really famous pattern that you have to see before you will be able to recognize this for your own games, and that is this checkmate. Giving check with the queen, forcing the enemy rook to take because that's the only option. And whenever a king is closed and surrounded by its own pieces, as you can see here, those are opportunities for your knight to just deliver a checkmate. We are just giving a check basically. But since the king can't move anywhere and nothing can capture our knight, this is a checkmate. There are some more advanced variations like the one here, which is a bit more complicated, but it's basically always the same pattern that we want to try and play. We want to first give some double checks so that we can move the enemy king into the corner. Then we want to force the enemy rook to stand next to the king, and then we want to deliver a checkmate, and this time we are doing that with the second knight. So this is 2 knights working together actually to deliver the checkmate. And the funny thing is, even if the rook wasn't here, this would still have been a checkmate because the knight is taking away that square as well. This is one of the most complicated smothered mates I have seen, so if you want you can solve this. This is a checkmate in 4, but I will be showing you the solution, so pause the video if you want to solve this yourself. So here we have another smothered checkmate, and it all starts with queen e6. The best move for black to draw out one more move is to play this rook to f7. If they play the king over here, we actually have a different, well, we actually have multiple types of checkmate. You can do this, which is a smothered mate, or you could also go for this, which is actually some kind of back rank mate here, because the king is stuck. So the best thing that black can do is block with the rook. We can take this, the king has to go into the corner, and then we have the pretty similar pattern that you have already seen. The king is all locked up, surrounded by its own pieces, and now we have a checkmate. One thing that looks similar to this, but it's a little bit different, is the corner mate. So this is again a checkmate with a knight when the enemy king is in the corner, And this time also we need a rook that cuts off some pieces, or this could be a queen or something else. But the checkmate here is basically forcing white into the corner with not a single legal move for the king, and then we just deliver a check with the knight, and that's immediately a checkmate as well. And this is not a smothered mate because the king is not smothered, it's not surrounded by its own pieces, but this is known as the corner mate. So it's important to know this as well. Even if you can't surround the enemy king, you can still deliver this checkmate. Rook and knight can also work together to deliver checkmate, and usually those are the hook mate or the Arabian mate, which we are going to cover both of them in this lesson. And this position, it is black to move, and it's checkmate in 2, and I hope that you can find this. I'm going to reveal the answer to you. The answer here is a hook mate, which we are going to start with the move rook to c3. Rook to c3 is a check, and there's only one legal move. This bishop takes, and then this is already checkmate. And this is what is known as the hook. It's basically the knight L shape together with the rook. And this is especially powerful because you are taking away these squares with the rook, this T shape basically. And then this knight is taking away this escaping square and also supporting the rook. But you do need something to support your knight, and also you do need something to take away that final remaining square. And here that is another piece of white that is blocking. So this is one of the patterns for the hook mate. This is another hook mate here. It is white to move, checkmate in 3. I will reveal the answer to you. The answer is to play queen takes f8. It's the only move that wins. Queen takes f8, rook takes f8, the enemy king has to move, and then this is another type of hook mate, where again we are creating this hook, the rook is forming the T shape, the knight is protecting this, protected by the pawn, this pawn is also helping, and we have one square here that is blocked by an enemy pawn as well. And this is the final one, a checkmate in 4. Again, a hook mate, so you can always pause and see if you can find this, but I more so just want to show you the patterns anyways. So I will reveal the solution. The solution is to play queen takes e2. And if you look at this, the king can't take us because the bishop is protecting this. So the rook has to take, and now we have a very beautiful hook mate. Knight c4 check. Only one legal move is going here with the king. Rook check, and then you can already recognize again the T shape with the rook, the knight protecting, and then the king can't go anywhere because of the pawn, and also its own pawn is blocking the king. And then I will also show you the Arabian mate. So the Arabian mate is also a knight and rook checkmate, but for this the enemy king needs to be in the corner. And I will show you the main pattern first. Here we have a checkmate in 4, which we can start with rook takes h7. So rook takes h7. Only one legal move is this. Then we have an incredible move here, pawn g7, and the king can't go anywhere, this, and now you will see our Arabian mate. And that is the knight is taking away these two squares, the enemy king is in the corner, and if we can just give a check with the rook, then we are going to be able to do a checkmate here. Rook h5 check, rook has to block, and this is a checkmate. So again, there is this L shape with the knight, it's protecting a rook, but now the rook is just delivering a checkmate to the enemy king that is in the corner. So that is the pattern you can also look for when you're attacking with the rook and knight. Here I have another one, so you can try to solve this. You can already see that the knight is taking away those two squares, so there is an Arabian mate that you can do. It is a checkmate in 4. So I will show you the solution. The solution here is to play rook to g1. This forces the enemy king basically to h8, because of course the queen is also taking away this square. And then here we have the most beautiful move, queen h7. We give away the queen, and now we just simply have our pattern. Check with the knight, the king is stuck, king has to go here, and then this is another Arabian mate, but of course it doesn't matter on which of those two squares you have the rook. As long as you have a rook there, you will always have the mate. Here we have another Arabian mate. It is white to move, checkmate in 3. So I will show you the solution. A similar pattern to what we have seen before. Queen takes g8, queen takes g8, knight takes f6, and again you can already see this, the king is stuck, it has to move to the corner, and then we have another Arabian mate. So I hope you will be able to spot this in your own games as well now. Now we have one more checkmating pattern to take a look at, and that is the Anastasia's mate. And most of the time this also involves a knight and a rook, sometimes also a queen. It's a similar idea where the king is in the corner and our knight is already taking away those squares, the pawn is here, so the king is very locked up. It basically almost can't do anything. And if we were able to just deliver a check to it, we would be winning. And we have to open up a file here with a sacrifice. And that is queen takes h7. King has to take, and then this check with the rook. And this is, of course, not a checkmate, because the queen can block. Now this is a checkmate. The king like this, and it can't go anywhere. Sometimes, of course, you will have to put in a little bit more effort. This is a checkmate in 3, but I think if you know the Anastasia mate pattern, you will be able to see this. Knight e7, rook takes, and then again we have the Anastasia mate. Same idea basically, checkmate with the queen. And this is the most difficult one. If you want, I would say definitely try to solve this. You have to find a checkmate in 4, and it's the only way to win in this position. So I will reveal the answer here. The solution is to start with the move rook f8. If we take a look at this, only one move for the king. And now we have a checkmate in 3, but you have to play knight to d6. This is already in our control. We're also using the knight. So the king here has 2 moves. First of all, if they go here, that's just a checkmate, because all of these squares are blocked. And if they move to a7, we have to first give another check with the rook, force them here, and then we also have this checkmate. So I also think this is an Anastasia's mate, because we have the same idea basically. The knight taking away those squares, and then the rook delivering this checkmate. But it looks a little bit different, and also the king is, of course, on a different side of the board. Now we are going to take a look at some knight endgames. So that is especially important because minor piece endgames are something many people don't study. So that means bishop versus knight, knight versus bishop, but there are some tricks that you can use. So here we are going to take a look at the example where we have a knight and our opponent has the bishop. And one of the tactics that we can use is we can put all of our pawns on the same color as the enemy bishop. And here you can see that we were able to achieve that. We have all of these pawns on the light squares, except of course for this little pawn here, but it doesn't really matter too much. And you could think, what is the benefit from this? But the benefit is, if you put all of your own pawns on the light squares, your opponent pawns, on what color will they be? Well, they will be on the dark squares. And we copy the color from our opponent's bishop. That means that the color for their pawns is not the same as their bishop. So the bishop actually can't protect any of those pawns. And there will be, in some situations, vulnerable pawns. Like for example, this one here. Of course, these ones are safe because they are protecting each other. But this one is weak. And that is why here it's first actually black to move. We can move our knight. We can attack this pawn. And there's nothing that black can do to defend this. If the king was very close by, maybe they could defend it with the king, but then sometimes you can just activate your own king as well and you can still win the pawn. So that's one technique, putting your pawns on the same color as the enemy bishop. There is also something else you can do, and that is the reverse technique, where you put your pawns on the opposite color from the enemy bishop. So all of our pawns are on dark squares. And this has the advantage that the bishop can never attack our pawns because they are basically untouchable. And here in this position, the benefit that we have is that we can activate our king and we can basically just come closer and there's not much black can do. Let's just say they move the king. Well, they drop this pawn. So they have a problem. They have to always stay very close by here with the king. So maybe they play this, for example. We can keep activating our king. Now you could think, well, black can now try to move, but you can see we are the ones making progress. And yeah, it doesn't really matter what I play for black. Black has to play a very, very defensive role here, defending everything with the bishop. And we are just going to simply be walking to promotion here. It doesn't really matter what I play for black. We are going to promote to a queen. So those are the two tactics that we can use. Or we put everything on the color that the enemy bishop has, or we put everything on the opposite color. And the difference is here in this particular position, we choose the opposite color because black has these backward pawns, a lot of these weak pawns that have to be protected, and our knight is also attacking them. And the other example here, we basically did it because we had this particular pawn here that we would have been able to identify earlier before we started the middle game that this was going to be a weakness for black that we can attack. So you can already see the fact that we can attack both colors with the knight and the enemy bishop can't do the same thing as a big benefit for the knight. One more thing that is a big benefit for the knight is whenever you have pawns in the endgame that are all on one side of the board. Because a bishop can beat a knight in the endgame because the bishop is extremely fast. It can move from one side of the board to the other side in one move. And a knight is going to struggle a lot to get to the other side of the board. But if you have all of your pawns on the same side, or of course if you are smart, if you force all of your pawns in the endgame to be on one side of the board, you have the benefit that now you have this knight, you can attack dark squares and light squares, and even though the enemy bishop is incredibly fast, it doesn't matter. We're only going to fight on one side on the board. We only have one battlefield here. There is one move here that wins the game for black. That move is knight to e8 because we're just going to activate the knight, and then we are in any case going to be able to win this pawn, which of course you can see here the pawns from white are on the dark squares, meaning we can attack them and white can't defend them. So we are basically using both strategies here. All pawns on one side of the board and also all pawns are white. There are things white can try. One thing that's interesting is, for example, they can try to give away a pawn because now they are breaking up everything and then they can start hunting with the bishop, for example, like this. But it doesn't even really matter. We can actually protect, also attack. Doesn't really matter where I move the bishop. There are always going to be a lot of troubles. We can even sacrifice this pawn so that we can grab this, and then this 2-pawn advantage is going to win us the game. One more tactic that they could potentially try is, of course, they can also just chill, move back and forth the bishop, but we are anyway going to just win this pawn and also get a winning endgame. So here you can see the knight really outclasses the bishop when all pawns are on one side of the board. One thing you have to be careful for though is that you don't trap your own knight. So here black plays bishop d7 and black is giving us a free pawn. But you shouldn't take this pawn, because if you take this, which happened during a game that I used for this particular example, white immediately loses the game. Immediately. b5. Look at this knight. The knight can't go anywhere. And that's often a problem. If you put your knight in a corner square, that's especially bad, because from the corner you only have 2 options. But even if you put it on the rim, for example here on this square, we only have 3 squares for the knight and all of those are in our enemy control. Pushing this of course also doesn't help because still we can't do much, and in the end, even though you can liberate your knight, this pawn is already way too far and it's gonna promote. So knight a7 immediately loses the game just because your knight gets trapped. And oftentimes it's gonna continue like this. The game is just gonna keep going, but black can just bring the king closer, attack the knight, and there's pretty much nothing you can do. Even if you try running away, they're just going to capture you, and if you don't do anything, in the end, you're going to lose your knight, and of course also lose this endgame. Now we have to take a look at some knight and pawn endgames. We're going to take a look at 3 of them, because those are also important. Here, black has 2 pawns and a knight versus 1 pawn. So the first thing that you might think is black should be winning this, but it's actually not the case, and that's something I want to show you, because if you don't know this, it's easy to mess up games that you thought were winning, but in reality they were a draw. And this is a draw because rook pawns and knights are actually enemies. Rook pawns and knights don't work well together. If you have a knight and a rook pawn, it's hard to promote it. And if you are trying to defend against the rook pawn that your opponent has, it's also hard. We're going to see that in the next example. And white can, if they are skilled and they know the right technique, they can hold a draw here. They can play king c6, attack the pawn, we have to defend it. They can play king d5, attack our knight, we have to move the knight. And that means white, first of all, wins this pawn. And you might be thinking, well, why does it matter? I mean, we can win this pawn and we can promote, but we won't be able to promote. The king comes closer, we grab the pawn, king comes closer. Well, first of all, we have to move the knight. Let's say we move the knight here. King comes closer, we push, king comes closer, and yeah, we can't push. And you might think, well, we can win, right? Because we still have our king. But white can actually hide in this corner, and if white just moves back and forth forever here between those 2 squares, we don't have anything, because as soon as we move the knight, this is a draw. And if we get closer with the king, this is actually a stalemate. White can't do anything, and white is also not in check. So this is a draw. So a knight and a rook pawn on the 7th rank don't work well together. If you have it with a rook pawn that is way back here, or even here in some cases, and your king is also close by, you will be able here to win the game. Now we are defending. We are the ones defending with a knight, and we are defending against the rook pawn. And this can be more difficult than defending against other pawns. So if you have to choose, try not to give your opponent a rook pawn, because the problem with a rook pawn is there's only one side of the board here that we can use to attack. If there is a pawn here, for example, you can attack it from multiple sides. You can already see how many squares we can use to attack a pawn there. But if a pawn is here, we are way more limited in these squares that we can use to attack it. Plus, if the enemy king is close by, you can already eliminate a couple of arrows, and you see that it's not so easy. And especially in these cases, using checks is very important. Because if you give checks with your knight in the endgame, you will always be buying yourself an extra move, forcing the enemy king to move. And here we have to go to the very crucial square knight c4. And this is the only way for white to keep a draw. Everything else loses. And knight c4 wins, because let's say they push, we can go to this crucial e3 square. First of all, if they push, the thing you want to do, of course, is sacrifice your knight. We are not going to win anyways, but if we can sacrifice the knight, we at least have a draw. And if they attack us, there's a pretty strange pattern here that we can use. Actually, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to show you it with f2 here. We can give a check and move back. We can give not a check, but we can move here. So we are grabbing this pawn. And we can give a check. We can give a check. And we can basically move between those three squares. And the thing is, if they ever push, we always have a fork. If they attack us, we will always be moving. We will always keep moving. And a lot of the times we're even going to move with a check. And in some cases, you can even play knight here to h2, yeah. But then you have to be careful, of course, that you don't lose the knight. And in the end here, we can just sacrifice and get a draw. This is our final position. Again, we are defending with a knight against the pawn. And this time it's not a rook pawn. So that's already a little bit better because we have more squares to attack it. Still, these pawns on the knight file are sometimes a bit annoying. Because if you draw arrows, you can already realize that some of the arrows that we could potentially draw are actually outside of the board. So we also have some limited options to attack. It's better to have pawns here and these files. Those are easier for us to attack. But this is also somewhat limited, but it is doable with the right calculation here. And there's only one move again for white where you can keep a draw, and that is knight to g6. You let the pawn move, knight here, you let the pawn move, and then we play this. And this is immediately a draw. Why? Well, of course, if they push, that's just a simple draw. If they get closer with the king, we are just going to repeat this pattern. We give a check, and we stand in front of the pawn. We give a check, and it's always the same thing. We always keep moving back and forth, and we never allow them to promote. And that way we will always be able to keep a draw. So that's it, everything I wanted to teach you about knights. If you enjoyed this, definitely subscribe, and as always, I'll see you in another video. Bye!